Hello, I'm Kelly Taylor Ryan, and this is Mainely Unspoken. Today we have the chairperson for the New Hampshire Center of Constitutional Studies, Diane Gilbert. Hi, Diane.
How you doing, Kelly?
Pretty good. I'm really glad that you're here today.
And I'm pleased to be here.
So the New Hampshire Center for Constitutional Studies, what do you do?
Ooh. Well, why don't you ask me why we did what we did, and then you'll know what we do.
Okay. Why?
I've been politically active in New Hampshire probably since about 1988 or 89. And joining with many different conservative groups, we would end up fighting one issue after another, writing to our state legislators and trying to influence them to go a certain way on a particular piece of legislation. But we had failed. We were really missing the root of the problem. The root of the problem was, should they have been passing the legislation for constitutional reasons? Not only that, but as we gathered in our groups, you know, and most of us hold down a 40 or 60-hour-a-week job, so this was in addition to trying to have a life and work. What I came to realize one day when I was sitting with one of my friends that spent a lot of time doing this with me, was sitting in a restaurant, and I finally said to her, you know, I am really tired of trying to put out these fires. It seems like we're good little firemen. Every time a fire gets set, we run around, we douse it, and 5 more are set, and we can't control those. She says, I said, I think we're going about this wrong. And so she says, well, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, well, I think the problem is that people don't understand their government. They don't understand what was crafted on their behalf. And I think that's what we need to get across to the people. Once they understand that about 90% of the legislation that comes up in a hearing or as a bill shouldn't be passed, our job will become easier, because then the people will insist on putting people in these seats that understand that we live in a government, in a nation with a limited government.
So most people don't understand the state constitution or the federal constitution.
Nor the relationship between them.
Okay. And so your organization is to teach people about this?
Well, our mission statement is to teach the principles of liberty and union in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. And yes, that's exactly why we exist.
Now, what does liberty and union mean?
That's a key phrase.
Okay.
And we borrowed it from another organization that we more or less fashioned ourselves after, the National Center for Constitutional Studies.
Oh, there's a national center.
There is, but we are not an affiliate per se. We are loosely coupled in the sense that we more or less modeled ourselves after them, and we use a lot of their materials to do our seminars and our workshops. But to get to your point, the phrase liberty in union simply means, and if you refer to your main constitution as you will more than likely see something like that used there in your Bill of Rights. You have a Bill of Rights in your main constitution?
The same way as probably the first 10, yeah.
Liberty in union simply means that we, the people, having all the rights initially, are willing to give up a certain portion of those rights in order to have greater protection for the rights that remain. So in liberty in union means that we form a union to create a national government to which we lend or give certain authority in order to protect the rights that we wish to retain for ourselves.
Right, like the federal constitution, is it 22 powers that the government, we've given over to the federal government?
There's between, some people say 17, some people say 20. It depends on how you count them.
Okay.
You know, if you want to count all the different prepositional phrases, and then you go into Article 4, you'll find a few more, which also tend to be repeated in some ways, but it's between 17 and 20, depending on how you count them. And the majority of them you'll find in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
And if people don't know what that list is, then if a state legislator or a federal legislator starts writing a law, and if you don't know that's outside of their bounds, you're not going to say anything.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But that wasn't always the case, you know. At one point in our history, late 18th century Americans in the Revolutionary War period, in the founding era, and also maybe up to mid-19th century, around the 1830s, 40s, Americans were very well informed about their government. And at that point in time, I think Americans were the most happy because the government was only this big. It was a truly limited government as the framers crafted it.
And they didn't add a whole lot of new laws back then either.
No, they didn't. No, they didn't.
All the amendments didn't come until after the Civil War or after the turn of the century, the 1900s?
The majority of them. Are you familiar with the French jurist Alexis de Tocqueville?
No.
Well, you know, back in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville was becoming concerned because it looked like France was headed for another revolution. And so he decided that he would travel to America to see why these Americans were so happy and so peaceful and prospering. And he came to America, he toured America looking for the richness in her harbors and the richness in her minerals, figuring they're happy because they're wealthy. What he found, though, was that the people were happy because the people were good.
The people were good?
Good. They were a moral and religious people, and therefore capable of governing themselves. Therefore, their government was limited, and they weren't laboring under the government that we labor under today. And so
the government wasn't intrusive.
Exactly. So you see, the presence of law is more or less a measure of the morality of a society, because
but also of the knowledge of a society.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
And if you don't know that somebody is stealing from you or doing something that's unjust, you're not going to speak up.
Exactly. You can't ask the question that you don't know enough to ask.
Well, everyone else is doing it, so they must be able to do this. Yeah.
Yes.
So knowledge and being responsible for their own actions, which
Exactly.
is goodness.
We live, well, if you ask most people, they'll tell you we live in a democracy. You've heard that, right?
And that is so untrue.
Oh, is it ever?
And yet how many people know that's not true? So say it again, Diane, please.
Not many. We do not live in a democracy. Our founding fathers created or crafted on our behalf a constitutional republic with representative government. We have a government that is based on the rule of law, not the whims of the people or the whims of man. We really need to grasp that and then connect that to what I said earlier about the morality of the people. Because the type of government we have, the constitutional republic that we have, requires a knowledgeable and informed citizenry and a moral citizenry, because only when people are guided by their inner conscience are they capable, fully capable, of being a self-governing people, which is what we are supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And it gets back to the government that the founders created being a very limited government.
Right. So what you do in your organization is you teach people, this is what the federal government can do, this is what the state government can do, and this is what you can do.
Well, we teach them the basics of constitutional government because it is so simple, and it just makes so much sense that people lock onto it like radar, and they say, wow, you know, this is easy to understand. And that was one of the purposes of our very tiny Constitution, was to keep the government from being too complicated and the laws very simple that are based upon it, so that the people could follow it.
And they were common sense laws.
Absolutely.
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 And what happened is that during the centuries, especially after the 1900s, and there became layers and layers and layers of laws, and we sort of lost track of the Constitution.
Exactly. Well, you know, there was a concerted effort back around the end of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. There were maybe a half a dozen or so very wealthy industrialists who had lost faith, let's say, or patience with the Constitution. Because the other attribute of the Constitution and a an objective of the government that the framers created was that the government go slowly, that it be deliberative, because they understood that this country was going to get big, it was going to get expansive, and it would reach the corners, the four corners of the continent. I mean, they understood that. And they wanted a government that would be forced to go slow enough so that the people could keep up with it. When the turn of the century, the 20th century, right, the 1900s, we had a group of wealthy industrialists who thought the Constitution was slowing things down just a bit too much. And so what they wanted to do was to teach the people less about the Constitution, and then they could have their way. And that's what they set about to do. And they were very influential in pulling many of the books that the 18th and 19th century American used in order to understand their government.
So
and
they started controlling
replacing them.
They started controlling the educational system.
Absolutely.
And once you start controlling the educational system, then you can control people.
And control the minds of the people.
Right. So we forgot all this. We forgot what our great-grandparents knew. And we're not taught what our great-grandparents were taught.
Well, actually, it was, if you're talking about your great-grandparents and my great-grandparents, it's true, we don't know as much as they did, but it was actually in and around that generation where things were let go. This is the generation that stopped propagating the information that needed to be propagated down through the generations. Now, I don't mean to vilify them. I'm sure they didn't do it as part of, some big agenda, but the fact is they didn't do it. Thankfully, enough has got passed down, though, even as late as my mother's generation to me, for me to be the age that I am and realize that something's gone wrong. And the other part of that we can be thankful about is that I'm not alone. A lot of people are starting to wake up to the fact that something's gone just drastically wrong.
Well, absolutely. We had Robert Schultz on, and you know what's happening with that, where for 3 years he was trying to get redress from the government. Please answer my questions. And they wouldn't. And he finally is down in Washington, but it took him 3 years and going on a fast to get the government to do something that Article 1 or Section 1, Article 1 of the Constitution says, your right to redress, because government doesn't like to answer you. They like to brush you aside, and that's another way they control you. But another point here is, what is the thing about the living Constitution? Is that what they promote? And what is a living Constitution?
Our organization subscribes to strict construction. Strict construction of the Constitution means, as James Madison and Jefferson said it should always mean, that the text of the Constitution speaks for itself. And if you are wondering what any particular part of the Constitution means, go back to the era in which it was ratified and take the meaning at that time. The group of historians or folks that believe that our Constitution is a living Constitution believes that our Constitution evolves with the popular culture, whatever the whim of the day is.
But that's sort of the opposite of the purpose of something written. If you write something down, it's not supposed to change.
Well, exactly right. And you really only need to open the Constitution to know how incorrect that theory is. The framers gave us Article 5, which is the article that says how to amend, how to change the Constitution if it needs changing. And you only need to open the Constitution and look to see that it's been amended 27 times.
And most of those times was after the Civil War.
Right.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting.
Right. So if the Constitution evolves in meaning with the popular whim, why did they bother to amend it? So, just open the document and you can see what a contradiction that is.
So we have written law. It's easy to read. What it reads, that's what it means.
That's right.
And yet we've traveled light years from that Constitution.
Exactly.
And people don't even believe what they read anymore, because it will say something in the Constitution, and then in everyday life it's not that way, and it's very incongruent, and they'll say, well, we may as well not read the Constitution because that's not how government is today.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But, you know, there are some hopeful signs, Kelly. 5 years ago when we started this organization and you mentioned the Constitution, people thought you were some, you know, radical, some right-wing radical. But now you mention it and people are interested. So some interesting things have gone on over that period of time. Just this past national election, I think people heard more about the Constitution and the fact that it's based on the rule of law than they'd heard probably all their lives. And that was a good thing, even though that put us through a lot of trying times, depending on what side you were on. It still opened up the people's eyes to the fact that we are living under a Constitution which defines our national government.
Okay, and all our senators, all our Congress people, they must uphold the Constitution. And if they don't, it's up to we the people to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that.
That's right.
And the problem is that people aren't saying, hey, you can't do that. They're doing things that they're not supposed to do, and no one's calling them on it.
That's right. Again, you can't ask the question that you don't know enough to ask. The people are basically ignorant. Now, please understand that word does not mean the people are stupid or the people are dumb. Being ignorant simply means you don't have the information. And unless somebody gives you the information, unless somebody imparts this information, unless you're educated properly on the roots of the American Republic, how are you going to know if what Congress is doing is right or wrong? You
And they
can't
don't
possibly know.
And they don't want to educate you.
No, they don't.
No. We had, let's see, Isabel, I can't think of her first name. She's an author in Maine that wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America.
Yes.
And that was just amazing of the story she told about what they were doing, even here in Maine. So your organization is teaching people, this is the Constitution, this is what you need to know, and it's really easy, and you need to confront your politicians in a civil way, in a knowledgeable way, to make sure that they stay within the limits of government.
Right, and I'm really pleased to hear you use the word easy, because one of the biggest myths that is propagated among the people, the body politic, is that you need to be a lawyer or an attorney to understand the Constitution. Nothing could be further from the truth. This was not written for a particular segment of society. The Constitution was written for the people. It is our document. And I got to pick up on one more myth, because it's just triggered this. If you ask most people what is the purpose of the Constitution, what do you think they would say?
It sets up the law for the country?
Well, that's what you would say. What do you think most people would say?
I don't know. What would
It gives me my rights.
Oh.
That is also a myth. Nothing could be further from the truth. We had all the rights, remember? We were 13 sovereign states, and we united under the Declaration of Independence, and we called ourselves the United States of America. That's another thing most people don't know, that it was the Declaration of Independence that gave us the name, the United States of America.
Okay.
And then, at that point, we were governing ourselves under the Articles of Confederation, and they weren't working. And the war ends, the American Revolution ends, and that's a very bloody 7-year war, and a lot of people paid the ultimate price for that. And suddenly, the states start arguing and bickering, and there's, France on one side of us, and Spain on the other, and Britain to the north of us, just waiting for us to fall apart, and then they would converge on us, and who knows where we'd be if that had happened. And so founding fathers like James Madison and George Washington and Ben Franklin and some other statesmen from the various states said, we can't let this happen. And so after several tries, they finally get a constitutional convention going down in Philadelphia, and 4 months later we have the document. We come out of the convention with a document now that the Congress approves, and it gets sent to the various states for ratification. The point I'm making here is we, the people, had all the rights as individual states. What we put into that document and then subsequently ratified, we said, okay, we are going to transfer this much power to a national government to govern on our behalf. So we had all the rights, right?
Right, the
Then the
government is-
Constitution
right.
came, right? Am I making this strongly enough?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
But most people are, that rights are given to them. No.
No.
We have the rights, and they've got to
No.
change their
The
thinking.
purpose of the document is to protect your God-given rights, the rights that you retained, and to limit government. That's
People
the
need to
only
read that
purpose.
Declaration of Independence.
Oh, they certainly
really
do.
Several times
Which is
over.
another point. You must never separate the two.
Right.
You cannot take the Constitution and read it as a standalone document. The principles that it embodies are embedded in the Declaration. And if you think of a business arrangement, if, for instance, when we went to incorporate our organization, we needed the articles of that organized us, which is our mission statement. And then we needed another set of articles, which became our bylaws. And so if you take those two documents to come up with an incorporated organization, those two documents serve the same purpose in our government. The Declaration was our mission statement. Here's who we are, here's what we're doing, here's why we did it. And then the Constitution is our bylaws. That's our operating rules.
Diane, you are not just the chairperson for the New Hampshire Center for Constitutional Studies. You're also a selectman in your own town, aren't you?
I am.
What is that like, and what are you coming across with the Constitution and actually being a selectman for your town?
We have a 5-man board for us that comprise our selectmen. You got the constitutionalist and then everything else.
Okay.
Sometimes I win a few, and sometimes I make it sensible enough so that the other 4, or some of the other 4 will come along and I'll make a point here and there. But it's an interesting arrangement, and I think it's more entertaining for the people because our meetings are televised. So I think it's like a Monday night at the movies for them.
Do you find that a lot of the people that are in state government have never read the Constitution?
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing. But then again, something good happened in New Hampshire. We had this big to-do over how to fund education, and the court probably issued one of the biggest pieces of judicial activism that most people will see in a long time, and that's opening our state constitution and deciding that the word cherish education meant the state is obligated to provide. And that has just opened up Pandora's box. And again, the people in New Hampshire are now being educated to the fact that we have a state constitution and that it governs everywhere that the national constitution hasn't been given authority to govern.
And education is one of them, right?
Yes, it is.
And people don't know that.
No, they don't. No, they don't. We have become so dependent on government to provide everything we need that...
And when they provide, they'll dangle a carrot, but there's controls and very intrusive measures when they start, coming into our state and telling us what to do.
Absolutely. And you asked about my being a selectman and what that is like. This is one of the areas where I debate very, very hard, and I try and make the other 4 board members see that there is no free lunch, that when you stick your hand out and take a federal grant, along with it comes strings. And we get into some very heated discussions over this because they think that if we don't take it, someone else will. Well, good. Let them have it and, set the people free. Set the people free. We just had, we took a grant a couple of years ago to refurbish one of our historic buildings. And in order to get the money, the people, this was the people's resource, the people's asset. In order to get the money to do the refurbishing, which is like a measly $320,000.
That's not measly,
well,
I'm sorry.
It is measly because that would be so easy for the people to raise themselves,
sure.
Have your fundraising schemes or whatever, and then be totally free to do with that building what you want. Now we have to allow certain segments of society have so much access to it. We have to allow certain organizations to have so much access to it.
Your control. They brought you out for
Exactly
$320,000.
right. And then this past year, we decided, or the school board said that, you know, we've got very crowded this year because we had taken in some tuition students from another town. How about if we use a couple of rooms in this building? We couldn't do it. We couldn't do it.
Because the government, the federal
Exactly
government
right.
was controlling you. So you no longer have your freedom.
Exactly right.
You're selling your freedom.
Exactly
That's
right.
awful. And do you think Washington knows what's good for people in New Hampshire?
Hardly.
Hardly.
But they know how to control us.
They certainly do. So you also was telling me a little bit about something called an invisible government. And
Oh, that's another thing that I see as a selectman. Sometimes the more you learn, you know, the less sleep you get at night. Well,
because what a web you discover.
oh, what a tangled web they have woven. There is, and be careful of this, and I'll get to your question in a minute, but I was at a convention with the organization just a couple of weeks ago, and there was a bevy of people from all different corners of society, some that are promoting this one world government stuff, and there were some people from the UN there, and it was all about technology, so to speak, and how we're becoming like a borderless world. I mean, those words kind of scare me. They send up red flags. But what I learned in that convention, listening to these speakers, was that those big government advocates are starting to catch on to the fact that people aren't crazy about big government anymore, and they're really responding to this downsizing of government. Be very careful about what seems like the other side coming over and supporting that downsizing of government. What they really mean to do, if I understood what was being said at this convention by various speakers, was that, yeah, we need to downsize government. And they said all the right words about not having so many bureaucrats, and et cetera. But what they mean to do is to push off the areas where government has taken control, which control you and I directly in our private lives, and moving them into these nonprofit organizations.
Now, how do they do that?
Well, they do it. They've done it. They're all around you now. That's the invisible government that I talked to you about. And they have
nonprofit organizations.
nonprofit organizations, mostly with government-sounding names. In fact, if you talk to these organizations and you ask them, are you an agency of government? They will say, well, we're quasi-government.
And what does that mean?
Well, exactly. There's no such thing in the Founders Constitution. There's no such thing in our state constitution, which sets up a quasi-government. There's no such thing in our national constitution, which sets up a quasi-government.
Can you give an example of this nonprofit organization that's a quasi-government?
Well, one of them is there's a finance, and I asked this directly to two organizations within this last year, and I got the same answer, so you know they're being educated at the same school. One of them was a financing authority in New Hampshire with a government-sounding name. You know, it's the New Hampshire blah, blah, blah Commission. And I said, what arm of government do you report to? And I knew there was no such thing. And they said, well, we don't really report to any government, any branch of the government. We're a quasi-branch of government. And I said, well, what does that mean? And I had to really pull it out of this person that what they are is a nonprofit organization which has been funded by taxpayer money to do what they do. Now, this one happened.
Wait a minute. So there's this non-governmental organization.
Right. So,
that they say it's quasi-government, and the taxpayers is funding the money?
Absolutely.
And what services are they providing?
Well, in this particular one was deciding which segments of society would get low-interest loans subsidized by the taxpayers. Totally unconstitutional. And I told her that. And I said, you have no authority to exist, madam. And you're really talking to the wrong person if you're trying to sell what you do as being legitimate.
I'm sure she didn't like that.
No, she didn't. She probably won't speak to me again.
But did she realize that it was...
No, they don't.
And
they
that's
think
the
they're
problem,
doing
though.
a good thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can't scorn these people, or be scornful of them. They really do believe that they're doing the right thing, that they're doing something to help somebody or some group of people. There was another organization that I spoke to earlier this year as well, and that was a conservation commission, which is...
That sounds governmental.
Doesn't it? It was like I believe they call themselves the New Hampshire, the Rockingham Conservation Commission or something like that. And that happens to be the name of a county in New Hampshire. And I said, are you a government agency? Well, we're a quasi-agency. I said, well, what does that mean? And I got the same story all over again. How are you funded? They're funded through local conservation commissions who pay dues to them. And the local conservation commission, which is a government agency, appointed, which are generally, whose board is generally appointed by the local governing board, such as the Board of Selectmen or councilors, take taxpayer money as part of their budget and then channel it to these organizations as their dues to them. And so we have this invisible government comprised of all these nonprofits. And in New Hampshire, I've noticed as a selectman that there is a nonprofit organization in existence for just about every public position, appointed or elected.
So even for the governor?
Well, there is a governors association.
And what do they do?
Well, they meet.
And it's a quasi-government
I
association?
would guess. I haven't looked into that one yet. That one's more on a national level. But just looking like within the state of New Hampshire itself.
So does the nonprofit organizations, do they have any power? I mean...
Well, they have, as the book here says, undue influence on the government that the people see. And this is the danger.
What's this undue influence book?
Oh, that's a book written by Ron Arnold. And it's on the influence of wealthy foundations and grant-driven environmental groups. And they have an impact on your local conservation commission. And they're well financed. And they have a lot of influence with what is going on out west and even in Maine and New Hampshire now. Didn't you just have a big slice of Maine given over to an environmental group here in New Hampshire, in Maine? The size of Rhode Island, I understand.
Do you know about that, Linda? Have you read about that? Okay, she knows. I don't know about that, but that's awful if that happens. I know we're losing a lot of our land.
It did happen.
It did happen. Gee, where was that? Okay. And so these organizations, these nonprofit organizations, this book will explain it?
This one will explain it from the environmental movement.
Oh, but that's just the environmental.
That's only one aspect of it.
So there's an organization in Maine that's quasi-government that's getting their funds and is giving away our land. Is that basically what you're saying?
Well, if within the environmental aspect of things, what happens, and Ron explains this in his book, is these wealthy foundations and also government money, which is your money, are channeled into these foundations who then spread it out into smaller groups right down into the local level. What happens is they will buy up huge areas of land and hold on to it. And because our Constitution says that the federal government cannot own land in a state without the approval of the legislature, and then only for purposes of building a fort or an arsenal or a dockyard or a post office or other needful buildings.
So this is a way to get around the Constitution.
This is a way to get around the Constitution. And what just happened down in Texas is one of the largest environmental groups is now about ready to transfer land that they purchased through these grants from these wealthy foundations, and more than likely a lot of taxpayer support, is going to purchase this land, and now they're going to turn around and sell it to the federal government again to be purchased by taxpayer money. So the taxpayers, buy this
Paying
land
rent.
over and over and over, and then they're kept off of it.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's only one aspect of it. And I do see a lot of this coming through even my town as selectmen. I look at some of these deeds that are creating these very interesting easements, which are then given to these nonprofit groups to monitor and hold. I saw one easement come through for a piece of land in Epping that cost our taxpayers $39,000, something like that, which is about 49% of the cost of this easement. And another group paid another 49%. And then this land commission, which is a nonprofit, put up 2%. And the deed, they have, within this easement, they have equal interest in that particular easement. So the taxpayers paid, somewhere around 49%, and then this other group who put up another 49%, also funded by taxpayer money. So now the taxpayers put up 98%.
But the people aren't making decisions about this. This is being all made
Exactly
without
right.
their
Exactly right. This is the invisible government that has been wrapped around the government that the people elect or appoint. And this invisible government is not answerable to the people. The people can't even see them. They don't even know who they are.
How do you get rid of them?
Well, the people have to wake up to the fact that this is what's going on. This is what's going on in government at all levels. These organizations, as I started to tell you earlier, exist for almost every elected position and just about every appointed position in government.
And not just a state level, but a national level too.
Right, but I mean, the best place to deal with it is on the local level, state by state, and just rip them out by the roots, refuse to fund them. They are so powerful that if you go through New Hampshire's laws, you will see that they have lobbied successfully to make it statutorily okay for local officials to collect taxpayer money in order to pay the dues that selectmen like myself and town clerks and town assessors and planners can all belong to these organizations at no cost to them. Now, to add insult to injury, once a year or so they do training, and the taxpayer will pick up the tab to send that public official to the training, pay their lodging, pay their food, and everything else that goes along with it, registrations to get them into the course. Now, you would think out of that you'd hear the story that, well, we go there so that we can learn to be good public servants. But and see what's going on in government, so obviously they're not learning how to keep their place under the Constitution. They're learning how to be more powerful in their position.
That's right.
At least that's what I'm
Learning
witnessing.
how to control, learning to get the power they
Exactly.
need. That's pretty
But
sad.
the people need to wake up, and dollars to donuts, you'll find a very similar structure here in Maine, and you really ought to look into it. Make a great investigation.
It sure would, yeah, wow. But you had a book in New Hampshire. They were called All the Nonprofits. Did you have that?
One of the magazines that I have with me is this magazine called Town and City, and it's published by another nonprofit, the New Hampshire Municipal Association. And I brought this because I wanted to show you that, I'm just not blowing smoke here. There is, if you go down this list, you'll see that there is a nonprofit organization for just about every public job in existence.
So we must have something like that
I
in
would
Maine.
say you do, because these roll up, to regional and national levels.
Wow. So we have to learn the Constitution, state and federal. We have to follow the money and find out what they're doing with our money. And any organization that's unconstitutional, we have to have it abolished.
They certainly shouldn't be funded by taxpayer money. I mean, they can exist if they want to. I'm a nonprofit. We exist without the benefit of taxpayer money.
Right.
We raise all our own money. So
And therefore you can't be controlled.
exactly.
You're free.
Right.
But these organizations, because they're getting taxed, they're puppets.
Exactly
They're puppets
right.
for those who are in control.
Exactly right. I mean, the foundations start at the national level. They're funded, and then they fund right down into the local level. And this is how the top-down influence occurs, which is so counter to the government that the framers created, because the framers created a bottom-up government. Anytime you ever read anything about Madison or Jefferson or any of the founding fathers, they talk about that the only safe place for liberty is in the people. And what they meant by that is we need to distribute power among the masses, because when power is concentrated, that's the next step to tyranny.
That's right.
So, you know, we don't have this kind of a government, as Ron shows it there. We have a bottom-up government.
You mentioned to me that there was a difference between statesmen and politicians. What's that difference?
A statesman is a citizen who secures a public office one way or another, appointed or elected, and does the right thing, regardless of whether or not it helps him get reelected. In other words, he will do the right thing no matter what. A politician will say and do what he has to do in order to stay in office and to support a reelection bid. So if it means setting the Constitution aside because popular whim is going in this direction, rather than to do the principal thing, which is to stand in the law, because as a public official, he should know that the people aren't always right about everything, and sometimes you have to say no. It's called tough love. And in order to protect all the people's liberty, you got to be over here where the law is and not following the whims of the people.
So a statesman is more of an educator as well, because he's saying, well, this is what the law is, so
Right.
this is what we have to do.
Right. Unfortunately, today, our public positions pay so well that most people holding them don't want to leave them, so they will say and do what they need to do to get reelected.
Do you think that we should give all elected officials, or even appointed officials that work for the state or the federal government, a test on the constitutions?
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
And if you gave them a test, how about your selectmen group? Would they pass?
No.
They wouldn't. Would you pass?
I think so.
You think so? Would President Bush pass?
Yes and no. Yes and no.
Without any help. I mean, he'd sit down all by himself.
I believe he's been well instructed on the Constitution. I believe he knows the difference, but he's not always following it.
So he's not a statesman.
Right. Well, let me do a little qualifying here.
Okay.
And I say this because this was a wake-up call for me once I got elected. Every meeting that we have, I'm doing things that I ought not to be doing.
What do you mean?
Well, for instance, elderly exemptions. I approve an elderly exemption. That's unconstitutional because the Founding Fathers said uniform taxation. You do not compartmentalize society. You do not partition them. When you partition society and you start doing this for this group and this for this group and this to this group, you're playing them off one against the other. And that's not uniform. The Founding Fathers said all taxation should be uniform. Now, you know, sometimes you got to work within the realm that you're in, and you hope over time that you can educate people to the point where they should realize that one day they're going to be elderly and plan for it. This didn't happen in the past half century in our country. You just
But for
can't.
many, many reasons.
Yes.
And because of the power players
Right.
manipulating how society is and
Right.
basically taking their wealth away from them,
Right.
so they couldn't plan for
Right.
their
Right,
future.
exactly. So you just can't rip the rug out, because that would send the country into a tailspin. It would send our town into a tailspin. and it would create much more chaos than you would be able to control, and then you would end up with a much worse problem. So you kind of have to like wean people off of these so-called entitlements that they've been have become so accustomed to hearing and seeing and getting. Bush has that problem now. So I know, because I know people who are close to Bush, and so I know that he understands the Constitution. I know that he understands what he's doing, but he's in a tough position because of this infrastructure that has been put into place. You just can't rip out almost a century's worth of what people have come to expect. You have to kind of wean them off it. So,
And what's he doing to wean us off of it?
well, I think he's starting to do a lot of the right things. For instance, and again, his hands are tied. He's working with one hand behind his back. The tax cut, not a lot, but it's...
But you yourself said that the tax code we have today is unconstitutional.
Absolutely is. Absolutely is.
So he talks about a tax cut, it's unconstitutional.
Right. No, well, the tax cut is not unconstitutional.
No, not the tax cut, the taxes themselves. So
Right.
why is he talking about a tax cut when he should figure out another way to run the
Well,
country?
understand, this is another myth. The most powerful branch of government is the legislature, and it was designed that way. The next most powerful branch is the executive, and the least powerful branch is the judiciary. You know what's happened to our government is that's been turned on its head. We have a lot of writing to do, R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G,
Correcting.
writing to
Okay.
do, because, and again, it gets back to you just can't rip the rug out from underneath these things. We have to get people back to understanding the way the government was designed to operate, because it is just foreign to them to hear anything about that.
And it's not just foreign to them, it's also very unhealthy for them.
Right, right. But our legislature is, as I say, the strongest branch. It would be up to the legislature to right these wrongs. The executive isn't supposed to pass law.
But he does. Look at all these executive orders.
Exactly right, and those are unconstitutional and ought not to be followed. But that's, see, we've come to a point in time where, well, it's become the custom, and that's the evolution theory of the Constitution. And when you're in that particular mode of operation, you're not on very stable footing. You're on shifting sands, and that's a bad thing.
That is a very bad thing. You know, one thing I wonder if you could talk about very briefly that a lot of people don't understand, it's called jury nullification. Can you talk a little bit about
Jury
that?
nullification simply means that we, the people, are the final arbiters of what is constitutional and what is not with respect to the law. So if you become part of a jury and you are hearing a case, at the end of all of the arguments, when all the arguments have been presented, the judge will turn to the jury and say, here's the law that applies. The first thing that the jury would do is to judge the law. Is this law constitutional? They would open the owner's manual. Of course, if they were well trained up in the Constitution, they wouldn't even need to open it, right? And they would say, there's no basis for this law. Therefore, if there's no basis for this law, if this law is repugnant to the Constitution, it is void. This person is guilty of nothing.
But people aren't taught about jury nullification.
absolutely
And a
not.
lot of people feel really bad. Oh, gee, we have to find him guilty because we have this evidence, but I don't know where this law came from, and they feel really bad. But they're not taught that there is jury nullification, and that's the final check on the legislators.
Absolutely.
Because if you keep on saying not guilty, those legislators are going to change the law.
Right. And you see, well, let me back up just a bit. I got a phone call yesterday from a gentleman who runs a Constitution group down in Massachusetts. He would like to be a speaker at our Constitution Day event this year.
And you have to speak about that, too.
Okay, and we got into a conversation over whether or not the Constitution was law. I said, of course it's law. The Constitution says ratification of this document makes this the supreme law in the land.
Yes.
The people ratified it, it's law. He said, who's enforcing it? I said, we are, we the people. He said, well, then it's not working. I said, I agree.
That's right.
I agree, because we the people are ignorant of our duty as a citizen of a constitutional republic.
But we can't blame ourselves.
No.
It's because the people in power,
Didn't teach
the
us.
people that are greedy, okay,
Didn't
that wanted
teach us.
more power, they didn't teach us,
That's
and they
right.
don't want us to know.
That's right.
And a lot of people in public access, they're being given a hard time sometimes because they want to get this information out, and the people in power says, no, I don't think we want the people to know that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. No, again, you know, I need to qualify the word ignorant. It's not that we're stupid and that we can't learn. We have not been taught. We have not been given the information. So when I use the word ignorant, it means we are ignorant as to what the law is, but not through our own doing.
Very interesting. But I think that's very important. Where can people find out about jury nullification? Because the judge isn't going to tell them. And I know lawyers will, because I've asked lawyers.
There's a great little organization that publishes a handbook called the Patriot's Handbook. And if I had my other briefcase with me, I'd probably have one I could leave with you. But I could leave you the address of where to get these things. In fact, there's a group in New Hampshire that distributes them. And if you wanted, say, a block of them, I could probably get you a block, and maybe you could pass them out.
Great, I certainly would. Excellent. So you were talking before I interrupted you about how things are upside down. Instead of the legislators being the most important, it's the judiciary.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. In the Federalist 78, I think it is, Alexander Hamilton explains the distribution of powers. And can I bring up another myth here?
Anything you want, yes.
Tell me, I'll pick on you.
Okay, gee.
Tell me what you understand about the three branches of government with respect to one another. What is their relationship?
Well, they're separate, and they're not supposed to work together because they check each other out.
And they're
Um,
equal?
yes, that they
No.
are equal, yes.
No.
Okay.
No, they are not equal. That's the myth. The Founding Fathers created those three branches of government as sovereign and co-independent, but they are not equal. And I already gave you that earlier. And you only have to open the U.S. Constitution to see this. Article 1 that sets up the legislature is much longer than Article 2, which sets up the executive, which is much longer than Article 3, which sets up the judiciary. So the power, because the people touch the legislature, at that time only the House and not the Senate, the power was given to the legislature because that's where the people had the most direct influence.
That's right.
Then the executive, and so they were given the purse.
Right.
You can't get anything funded that the legislature doesn't approve. And then once funded and passed into law, then the executive was given the sword to execute the law and to see that it was followed. And over here in the court, all they got was a set of law books and an opinion. There's no power given to them. In fact, if you go all the way back, while the House and the Senate got a nice little wing in the Capitol building, and the executive got a nice little mansion, the Senate, the judiciary was put into the cellar underneath the Senate
Oh my
building.
goodness, you're kidding. Well, that makes it clear.
In fact, they never had their own building till 1933.
Is that a fact? And all those things happened in 1933 with
Isn't it
Roosevelt.
amazing,
Isn't
huh?
that amazing how everything sort of fits in together? You teach these seminars,
Right.
and who will you go to come to Maine to teach them? Do you go to schoolrooms? I mean, what are you offering as far as the seminars are concerned?
The seminars are basically tailored to what people want. We've done seminars that are done in 1 8-hour period. We've done seminars that are done, say, over a period of 3 weeks, 3 to 4 hours at a sitting. So each one is more or less tailored to what the people want. However, they all teach basically the same content. and it's just the basics. That's all people need is the basics. Once people understand the basics of their government, they start listening differently, and then it's self-education from that point on.
And they can hold their ground,
Yes, they can.
even against an attorney.
Oh, they can. You can't believe how much fun that is.
Oh, I know. You know, now since I know this stuff and I hear attorneys talk, I go, what?
Well,
Very
you know, the
interesting.
sad thing is, and most attorneys will tell you this, and I've had attorneys tell me, they go all through law school without even opening the document.
That's right. I've heard that too. Matter of fact, Robert Schultz spoke at a law school, and they were talking about that. They don't learn the law. They learn procedures and
Right.
paperwork.
They learn case law, which is not law. Case law is judge's opinion. And by definition, if you look up opinion in the dictionary, you will see that it is not synonymous with the word law.
Some lawyers will want to believe otherwise. So you would go to Girl Scout troops and teach this. You would go to PTAs and teach this. You would go to church groups and teach this. You would go to a community neighborhood. So
We would.
anybody, you would go to a law firm.
We would.
Anyone that wanted to learn this,
Yes.
you would travel. And do you teach it yourself or other people? Okay.
Sometimes we bring in instructors if we're doing something that is very specific and they really want to drill down into something. But like, for instance, we just had a property rights seminar, and Ron Arnold, by the way, came in and spoke. And then we had another fellow come up from Massachusetts who's an attorney. And another fellow that was part of that seminar also came up from Massachusetts. He's a constitutional scholar. He actually runs a school and teaches constitutional government.
Are these seminars that you teach expensive?
No, sometimes they're even free.
Sometimes. So people should call. We only have about 2 minutes left.
Ooh.
We haven't talked about Constitution Day yet.
Right, let's talk about Constitution Day. Constitution Day is September 17th.
Which is a Sunday.
No,
Oh.
Constitution Day is September 17th.
Okay.
That's the day that the framers emerged from Independence Hall with the draft of the document in their hand. We celebrate Constitution Day each year as close to the 17th as possible. This year, the best we could do is September 23rd. It's you were there last year.
I was. It was
it's a very
wonderful.
patriotic,
Oh.
uplifting. Did you get to go to any of the workshops?
I did. They were fun. They were
educational.
educational. It was just and entertaining.
Right,
Wow.
right. We
Not
feed
drab.
you.
And the
we
food was great.
feed
Yes.
you.
And then you had that great constitutional attorney from Washington to
Herb
speak.
Titus.
And this year you're having Congressman.
Congressman Ron Paul, one of the strongest advocates for constitutional government. Ron Paul is, we like to call him an ambassador for the Constitution. Yeah.
So anyone can attend.
Anybody can attend, just need to register.
Okay. And they would call.
They would call 603-679-1320.
Would you say it one more time? I'm sure it's on the screen, but one more time. Go ahead.
603-679-1320. You will more than likely get a voice or an answering machine. Don't be afraid of it. Please leave your name and number, and we do monitor those calls throughout the day.
Okay. And they want to attend. It's going to be so much fun.
You do want to attend.
And it's from what, 3 in the afternoon until 9 o'clock at night?
Yes.
in
3 in the afternoon is, actually we open the doors at 2 to register. And then the seminars, the workshops begin at 3. This year there are 6. They run 3 up. And then we go to dinner, and we present a little skit later on by the Founding Fathers. And
All
by the
dressed
way,
up?
our theme this year is America is a Republic.
Excellent, excellent. One last comment. What do you want your viewers to remember?
I want the viewers to not remember, but take action. Please, people, you need to investigate the government that was crafted on your behalf. If we don't change where this government is going by educating the people, my grandchildren and the younger people today who are raising today's generation will not have the same country that we knew, because we certainly aren't in the same country as our 18th century Americans. We are nowhere near as free as an 18th century American.
Thank you, Diane.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You want to go to Constitution Day in Nashville, New Hampshire? eyes will open up with this information you'll receive. It's a lot of fun. It's entertaining. It's on a Sunday afternoon. Good time to go. Call Diane with your questions.
Yep.
And look up on her website. Lots of information there, too. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.